Wait. Are we done? Okay. Hello. Hello, and welcome. I'm Nour Hariri. We are DiEM25, a radical political movement for Europe, and this is another live discussion on a vital topic of the day featuring subversive ideas you won't hear anywhere else. And tonight, we shift our focus to the Middle East. A year has passed since the Hamas-led attacks of October 7th, and the Israeli government has now brought the region to the brink of war. Israel's genocide in Gaza has so far killed over 41,000 Palestinians, possibly more, according to the UN, mostly women and children, and displaced millions. 1 in 5 Palestinians are facing starvation. Israeli operations have now expanded to Lebanon, killing 2,000 people so far and injuring thousands more. 1.2 million are displaced, 400,000 have fled to Syria. And assassinations by Israel have taken tensions to boiling point, with Tehran now entering the fray. Yet, despite widespread protests across the world and diplomatic condemnation from various nations and international bodies, no meaningful pressure has been applied to Israel to halt the war or to shift policy. Pro-Palestine activism, especially in Europe, still faces harsh repression, with events banned outright in Germany and activists subjected to intimidation, legal threats, and accusations of anti-Semitism. And so Israel's murderous campaign in the Middle East continues undeterred, fully backed by the US, Germany, and other Western governments. So how did we get here? What could a wider war mean for the Middle East and for Europe? And how should we assess activist strategies moving forward? Our panel for you today includes our own Yanis Varoufakis, and we've also got Wieland Hoban, the chair of Jewish Voice for a Just Peace, a prominent pro-Palestine organization in Germany. We have Lucas Febraro of BDS, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Movement, the Syrian-German writer and presenter Nour Hariri, and longtime pro-Palestine activist Evi Petzenkoraki, as well as the German-Greek academic and international relations expert Carolina Rehman, and you out there, if you've got thoughts, comments, rants, anything you want to say, ideas, questions for our panel, then just put them in the YouTube chat and we'll put them to our panel. I'd now like to hand the floor over to Yanis. Please start us off with a summary of how we arrived at this point.
Thank you, Maran. On the 7th of October, 2023, the world stopped having an alibi, the alibi of not knowing what is happening in the ancient land of Palestine. The Western media, our governments, the Zionist lobby have expended enormous efforts to distort the historical significance of the 7th of October, to present it as a massacre of Israelis, as a war crime and nothing but, as if the Gaza Strip was a country that suddenly attacked another country, a member state of the United Nations. Any clearly thinking person, independently of whether they support the Palestinian cause or not, should be able, as long as they have even the most slight of commitments to international law and to logic, to separate the act of resistance of bringing down that hideous fence, which is not a fence separating these countries, but it is a fence defining the perimeter of the largest open-air prison in the world. Separate this act of not only legitimate resistance, but if you have been encased unlawfully in an open-air prison camp, you not only have the right to bring down that fence and to attack anyone who is guarding it and ensuring that you are fenced in, but you have a duty to do this. So we need to separate this act of resistance, any war crimes committed by those who resisted. So let me be absolutely clear on this. Breaking down a fence that is part of your concentration camp, and whose intention, the intention of that fence, is to deny you and your people basic human rights, and to effectively cause the population within, the descendants of refugees, to wither through malnutrition, through disease, through maybe emigration if they are allowed to leave. This resistance is a duty. In sharp contrast, violating civilians or abducting them, that is a war crime. And international law must condemn war crimes wherever they happen, for whatever reason they happen. This is why yesterday, to mark the anniversary, Brian Eno and myself, we wrote to the judges of the criminal court, effectively saying that back in January, when we heard that the court on which the judges sit had decided to hear the case, we were encouraged, mildly encouraged, because humanity needs an international criminal court that upholds the rule of law and the principles that are outlined at the beginning. However, we also reminded the judges that since January, all matters regarding events in the Gaza Strip, in Gaza, are beyond dispute. We told them that Israel's government has set out to eliminate, systematically to eliminate, every aspect of Palestinian life. We've seen the most intensive bombing of a densely populated urban area in living memory. We've seen the most deliberate starvation of a population since the Second World War, at least. We've seen the systematic destruction of health facilities. Schools were attacked, universities, libraries, archives, cultural centers, mosques, churches, heritage sites. Professors and teachers were killed. Doctors and nurses, along with their patients and their, in the case of educational establishments, their pupils and their students, entire families being on the grounds. And of course, while all this was happening under the cover of the conflict in Gaza, Israeli settlers continued to do what Israeli settlers were doing since 1948, protected by IDF soldiers, that is, evict Palestinians from their ancestral homeland, from their homes, as part of 8-decade-old almost process of ethnically cleansing, slow burning genocide, which in the last year has become a very fast accelerating genocide. And we told them, the judges, that these are not just violations of the government. We can see that what the Knesset has done, it is essentially, with 65 votes to 9, ignored the International Court of Justice ruling that the occupied territories are unlawfully occupied. Here you have effectively a whole regime which is hell-bent on violating international law. It's been doing it now for many decades. And what we've seen on the 7th of October in 2023 is that if you cage people and you treat them like animals, what do you expect? There is going to be an uprising, and there will be violence, and there will be war crimes. We do not justify the war crimes. We want the International Criminal Court to prosecute all war crimes independently of who committed them, because international law either applies to everyone or it applies to no one. Having said that, let us now move beyond the use of logic and law in order to argue for the Palestinians. Let us now look at ourselves as as supporters of the Palestinian people, as citizens of the world who know that unless Palestine is free, we are not going to be free. Robert Fisk, the great journalist who used to write for The Independent, once said that unless Palestine becomes free, the American people will not be free. And you understand the repercussions of that. I think it's important to take stock of the situation. I may upset some of you by saying that I don't agree with the chant that I also chant when I'm in demonstrations, that Palestine will be necessarily free. This is the goal. But I think it is a very big mistake to take it for granted that we will win. And I'm saying this because what is happening in Israel, in Palestine, since 1948 is a white settler enterprise. It's a white settler racist apartheid process of eliminating a people and replacing them with white settlers. I have friends and lots of people write to me and say, but how can the United States continue to support Israel? How can Britain continue to support Israel after the last year of atrocity being added upon atrocity? How can Germany and France do that? The answer is, how can they not do that? You see, what is happening in the ancient land of Palestine has been tried and tested by these powers. What is the United States? It's a white settler project. Initially, it was on the East Coast, 13 little poor and decrepit colonies set up mainly by the British, but containing many Europeans, which turned into superpower through violence and through ethnic cleansing. They moved to the West. They killed the whole of the population. They essentially established the pattern that you declare a land to be free of people, terra nullius, as the British did in Australia. When the British went to Australia, they looked at 5 million Aborigines and they said, okay, these are not people. So this is a land without people. So it's a land without people for a people without a land. That is for the convicts and everybody else who was going to come from Britain and colonize Australia. And they killed the Aboriginal people. There were 5.5 million. How many of them are left now? Similarly, what is happening with Native Americans? They have been obliterated. And the ones who are remaining stay in Bantustans called reservations. That is what Netanyahu wants to do. But it's not also only what Netanyahu wants to do. This is why it's important not to focus our criticism on Netanyahu. It's what Ben-Gurion wanted, the first Israeli prime minister. And how do I know that? Because he told us so. In a fascinating discussion with a historian, Nahum Goldman, I believe was his name. And this is verbatim. I've got it here. I'm reading it off my screen. Nahum Goldman quotes Ben-Gurion in a conversation they had, saying the following. Ben-Gurion said, if I was an Arab leader, I would never make terms with Israel. That is not true. We have taken their countries. Sure, God promised it to us, but what does it matter to them? That's Ben-Gurion talking about the Palestinians. Our God, the Jewish God, is not theirs. We come from Israel, it's true. But that was 2,000 years ago. And what is it to them? Yes, there's been anti-Semitism, the Nazis, Hitler, Auschwitz, but was that their fault? That's, Ben-Gurion. I repeat this. It is Ben-Gurion saying that. They only see one thing. We've come here and stolen their country. Why should they accept that? They may perhaps forget this in 1 or 2 generations' time. That's what Ben-Gurion was hoping. But how can they accept it when the land theft continues to this day? The concentration camp in Gaza continues to this day. How can they possibly forget it? And then he continues, so it's simple, he says. We have to stay strong and maintain a powerful army. And what did he mean by staying strong? I think that there was another moment in 1956, in April 1956, when the answer was given by another prominent Israeli, Ben-Gurion's at the time chief of staff, Moshe Dayan, who later became the defense minister, and much, much later, during the Oslo negotiations, he was the foreign minister of Israel. Sometime in April 1956, an Israeli settler, very close to the Gaza fence, was killed, shot, dead, by a Palestinian fighter who had crossed the border, not a border, the fence, and killed that settler. And Moshe Dayan made a point of going to his funeral. And he said, let us, and here I'm quoting again, that's Moshe Dayan saying, let us not hurl blame at the murderers. Why should we complain of their hatred for us? 8 years. This is Moshe Dayan talking about the Palestinians of Gaza. That is 1956. 8 years they've sat in the refugee camps of Gaza and seen with their own eyes how we have made a homeland of the soil of the villages where they and their forebears once dwelt. Not from the Arabs of Gaza must we demand the blood of Roy, the dead man, but from ourselves. So effectively what he's saying is that, but this is what we do. We are settlers. So we need to keep killing them until we get rid of them. Otherwise, don't blame them for attacking us, because this is what we would do if we were them. This is critical. And let me, so as not to speak for much longer, turn to today, because everything I've said so far is an attempt to demonstrate that what is happening is the natural, logical extension of what has been happening since 1948. It's a white settler, imperialist, colonial project. What did we expect? The moment the West is continuing to arm these white settlers, if the West continued to arm the Boers, the white supremacists ruling apartheid South Africa, Nelson Mandela would have died in jail, and there would have been no overthrow of apartheid. Now, let us not fall in love with our success to defeat South African apartheid, because, comrades, I'm going to again sadden you by saying that the two are similar in terms of you have two apartheid states, South Africa and Israel, but they differ in one important respect. The white supremacists in South Africa needed black labor, black proletarian labor. Without black proletarian labor, their mines and their factories could not function. Once upon a time, the Israeli apartheid system also needed Palestinian labor, but no longer. Especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the mass migration of Jews from the Soviet Union and East Germany to Israel, and with the economic growth in Israel, two things happened. Firstly, the proletarian population from Eastern Europe grew, so they could replace the Palestinians who were crossing the Green Line to work in Israel proper, in pre-1967 Israel. And the second thing that could happen was that the Israeli bourgeoisie was rich enough to import Filipinos, people from Thailand, and so on and so forth. And you saw some people who were abducted and killed on the 7th of October from those parts of the world. So this is, so allow me to be very brutal, but to make a logical point. The white supremacists in South Africa, if they could press a button and eliminate all the blacks from South Africa, they wouldn't, because they needed them. The Israeli supremacists, they would press it. They would press it because they don't really need the Palestinian proletarian labor anymore. This is why our struggle to bring down Israeli apartheid is much harder than the struggle to bring down South African apartheid. And one last thought, and I'll close with that. I appeal to everyone, not amongst our panel, but to people who are listening, whoever is listening. I'm appealing to all of you. Do not allow yourselves to be sidetracked by Western media who take the bait very willingly. Maybe it's not even a bait for them. Maybe they are part of the propaganda of latching on to the escalation of this mass killing spree of the Israeli army into Lebanon, into Yemen, possibly into Iran. And there is an escalation. And, there's nothing that Western commentators love more than turning this into a large geopolitical discussion. Now that we've moved beyond Gaza and Iran and nuclear weapons and maybe Russia and maybe China are coming in, what does this mean for Europe? What does it mean for the world? It's a mistake. Firstly, it doesn't mean anything for Europe. The war in Ukraine is a clear and present threat to European interests and European security. But the war in Israel-Palestine is fully contained. Why is it fully contained? Because you have the complete domination and hegemony of the United States as exercised through the Arab states, not only through Israel, but all the Arab states are complicit. Every single one of them surrounding Jordan, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, remember the Abraham Accords, all the way to Morocco. They are all in the pocket of Israel and the United States, every single one of them. The king of Jordan may kick and scream about what's happening to the Palestinians, but he gets his party line straight from Washington, D.C. Yeah? Lebanon has been destroyed a long time ago. It doesn't exist as a state, right? So even if Iran had nuclear weapons, Iran is not stupid enough to use them, and I don't think Israelis are stupid enough to use them either. So the whole discussion about escalation and nuclear weapons and what, it's all besides the point. It is all noise. This is what Netanyahu is doing. He's expanding, escalating the war so that we talk about nuclear weapons, about Iran, about South Lebanon, rather than the real issue, which is the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza, in East Jerusalem, and in the West Bank. So what is absolutely essential for us is to keep focusing, with laser vision on what's happening in Gaza, in East Jerusalem, and in the West Bank. What's happening to Lebanon is, of course, very significant for the people of Lebanon. What's happening in Yemen is significant to the people of Yemen. But we'll discuss all this after Palestine is free. And it's not guaranteed that it will be free. We must not, sound stupid by saying that there is a historical process which inevitably will yield a good outcome. Talk to the Aborigines in Australia. It didn't happen. Talk to the Native Americans in the United States. It did not happen. They were not freed. They will forever remain slaves of a white settlement project. That is why we are agents. History will not do it for us. We all have to work to make sure that this is not another defeat of humanism.
Thank you, Yanis. Wieland, I would like to bring you in to react to what Yanis said, and also to understand a little bit more about how you see the role of Jewish peace movements in Europe evolving in response to the events that Yanis has laid out. I think you're muted. Yep, go for it.
Yeah, first I'd like to just take up a point that Yanis made at the end, that the fate of Lebanon can be discussed when Palestine is free later on. But, we only need to look at some of the maximalist Israeli colonial agendas to see that there are people who want to take over southern Lebanon as well as part of the Zionist colonial project. And it's not as if Israel has never occupied Lebanon before, and it's not as if the Sheba farms haven't been occupied as well. So this is all very closely connected, and I absolutely agree that expanding the war is a way to distract from the genocide in Gaza. That everyone is talking about, okay, what's the state of Hezbollah? What is Iran going to do, etc. A lot of speculation, and then a lot of people giving their informed opinions about that. But let's not forget that we are dealing with people who have gone beyond rational red lines that had been there before in order to realize plans that were there before. These are not new ideas. So I think we have to be aware of the potential of this escalation, not only of Zionist destruction, but also of Zionist colonization. And, there are plans for Gaza as well after sufficient numbers of Palestinians have been annihilated or expelled. But you asked about Jewish peace activism in Europe. And America is, of course, the place where it's the most visible, the most present. Of course, in the USA, we're looking at a Jewish population of about 7 million people. That's something that here in Germany we can only dream of. So, of course, the conditions are very different for them there. But what's clear is that for the younger generations of American Jews, such as students from middle-class backgrounds who may have grown up with a certain soft Zionism from their parents, that they're rejecting that, and that they're not accepting this, well, I guess what I think Mark Lamont Hill called the Palestine exception, or also progressive except for Palestine, right? This idea that you can be against racism and against exploitation and against wars and all these things, but when it comes to Palestine and Palestinians, these criteria don't really apply. They're rejecting that. They're connecting things. They're saying, okay, if Black lives matter, then Palestinian lives also matter. And if we demonstrate against white supremacy in America, then we have to demonstrate against Jewish supremacy in Israel, Palestine. So it's not new, but of course there has been an awakening that intensifies the more the killing and the destruction continues. And definitely Jewish opinion is changing because, of course, generations shift, and the younger generation is far more progressive when it comes to the issue of Israel than the generation of their parents. And as I said, in Europe, we're dealing with far smaller populations of Jews, but in Europe too, just in the last year, there have been several new organizations that have formed. Our organization, Jewish Voice, we were founded 21 years ago. And back then, there weren't that many groups doing this sort of thing from a specifically Jewish perspective. There was already JVP in the USA. Of course, they're the big pioneers in this regard, and still the most, I guess you could say, kind of the juggernaut among the Jewish groups. There were one or two British groups as well. There were a couple of groups in Europe, but it's nothing like now. And this is true of the entire activist scene, because in Germany, it seems like almost every university now has some Students for Palestine group. At various universities, we've seen student encampments, some of them maybe more protests, but a lot of them having different kinds of events with discussion, with film screenings, this idea of the teach-in that was so important, in the days of the Vietnam anti-war movement. This is something that I think also because the current generation of students maybe looks to America a bit more than the previous one. And so they were taking the lead for these encampments also from American students. And in some places, they're also being confronted with police violence, and universities are calling the cops on their own students. But they're really persevering, and they're showing a lot of courage and a lot of hunger for action, and also hunger for learning. They've been like absorbing sort of histories of anti-colonial movements sort of on a daily basis, and organizing events and digging out films, about Algeria or sessions on Fanon. So there's actually this immense potential. At the same time, of course, as this, not only the shocking horror of Gaza and Palestine, but also the sometimes very demoralizing fact that that all our demonstrations are not ending it, and also the demonstrations of many thousands in other places are not ending it. Even if you see, in London, that you might get 500,000 on the streets, even something that's unimaginable in Germany, but even that doesn't end it. And so we just always have to keep in mind that we're in this for the long haul, and we have to make sure that the younger activists now, who came in with urgency and I guess a kind of impatience for change also, that they stay with this even without immediate results to show for this, that they understand that building the movement is essential for the future, for this long haul. for people to find their place in it and to use the skills that they already had and are developing and are passing on to more people. There really has to be a strong focus on movement building, because otherwise, if we just sort of look at it in a very cold analysis of what has been achieved, then we have very little to show for it in terms of ending the genocide, ending arms deliveries. But actually, the root of international law is, I think, more important than maybe some people realize, because it was obvious that Israel would not be impressed by what goes on in The Hague at the International Court of Justice. But other countries are a bit more nervous about whether they have intimate ties with a country that might actually end up being found guilty of genocide. And also the Nicaragua's case against Germany for assisting genocide, that had real results, because it was after that Germany reconsidered granting export licenses for arms to Israel. German arms to Israel have now gone way down. And this was achieved via international law. International law will not affect Israel directly because it spits on international law. But other countries who still want to retain a certain legitimacy and acceptability, they will step by step be moving away. And that was confirmed also in the other ICJ case, where what was obvious already, the illegality of the occupation, was spelled out and reaffirmed in a way that to make it impossible to ignore and to stress the aspect of complicity. It was said to the countries of the world, if you support this, you are complicit. And even if technically it's only the occupation, it's obvious to anyone that this occupation is not just some entity of its own, it is carried out by the state of Israel. So ultimately, if one refuses to support the occupation, one has to refuse to support Israel as such.
Thank you, Wieland. Noor, you had your hand up there. Nour Hariri, the floor is yours. Would you like to comment on what you've heard?
Yes, actually, hello. I don't want to take a long time. Actually, Yanis and Wieland said it all and explained everything. Maybe I'd like to just add a few points. First of all, it's really hard for me to talk about October 7th after all the lives lost in Gaza. Thousands of victims have been killed, displaced, and now we see even more victims falling in Lebanon, as you know, and other areas as well. We can agree on or disagree about what happened on October 7th, but I think we might even wish it hadn't happened. But the most important thing for me here is to stress that this event was not the cause, it was the result. And if it didn't happen that day, it would have happened another way, just as painful and tragic. This isn't, of course, about justifying or condemning. It's simply a description of what has happened. So it's the result of years of violations, killings, displacements, broken promises, and settlements. But the problem here is that Western mainstream media often tries to spin this as some kind of a clash of civilization. Like, for example, it's Islam against Christianity and Judaism, or the Middle East against the West. But that's not the reality. People in the Middle East, they want to live side by side with Christian people. They want to coexist. But here's the thing, real peace isn't going to happen unless Palestinian rights are respected. And it's not about choosing sides in some religious battle. And real peace comes through more, and the real peace that comes through violence and more humiliation or ethnic cleansing, that is not considered as peace. It has to be built on fairness and on justice for everyone, not by crushing one group to uplift another. So it's really naive to think that, for example, Iran, Hamas, or Hezbollah are the real reasons for all of this, or that Netanyahu is only fighting them. This isn't Israel's war against Iran, Hamas, or fundamentalism. This is Israel's war against the Palestinian people. And Netanyahu has used what happened on October 7th to push his agenda forward. Throughout its history, Israel has always found some group or some country to blame for its actions. Sometimes it was the Soviet Union, and sometimes it was the Arab countries, and today it's Iran. And let's not forget that Iran itself was back in time, it was an ally for Israel. So this is politics. Politics change, and of course that does not mean that Iran or any Arab regime here is innocent. But it only means that that Netanyahu's war is against the Palestinian people, and his only goal now is to humiliate the people in the region so they don't rebel or resist or ask for their rights in any way.
Thank you for that, Noor. Couple of quick comments and questions from the chat. Salvatore asked, do you think the actions of the Israeli government might lead to the disintegration of Israel itself? Are there tensions inside and outside Israel that could end up in a civil war? Ahmed asks us to comment on the possibility of a regional war involving Iran, closing the Strait of Hormuz, etc., spike in oil prices, which I think perhaps plays a little bit into the narrative that you were referring to there, Yanis. And Mutineer9 asks, if you still think a two-state solution, well, says, if you still think a two-state solution is possible, you are delusional. Lucas Febraro, I would like to bring you in. You've heard Wieland's comments about playing the long game, despite the many bumps in the road for activists on this issue. And when we spoke last December, we had an interview with you, and you suggested that Israel back then was losing the information war. Do you still think this is the case, and how do you think this plays into the actual realities on the ground?
Well, it's hard to win the information war when you're committing a genocide and you're gleefully displaying this genocide for the world to see proudly, making reels and TikToks out of it, like Israeli soldiers are. I mean, clearly they have a very different conception of what it means to win the information war. But however it is that they thought that this might land in out to the rest of the world, if they even gave went so far as having these thoughts to begin with, they're very wrong, because obviously the general reaction is disgust, is people are just appalled at it. And on the other hand, obviously, the Palestinians also have smartphones. It's difficult to charge them. It's difficult to get an internet connection, but they're still doing it. So they're also showing what's happening on the other side, on the side of the people who are getting this genocide inflicted upon them. So it's very difficult to win an information war with those dynamics. In fact, just a few days ago, Al Jazeera released a wonderful documentary about war crimes in Gaza. If our audience, I'm sure many of you have seen it or at least heard about it. If you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend that you do. And it's a very important documentary. It's a historical record, and some of these things also, as a matter of fact, were played in a place where they belong, which is on the floor of the International Court of Justice, when South Africa brought their case against Israel back in February, if I'm not mistaken. Some of those TikToks, some of those reels of Israeli soldiers displaying these war crimes were played there as evidence of war crimes, which again is exactly what they are, nothing more, nothing less. So yes, to your question, Mayor, I do think that Israel has lost the information war to the extent that we can even conceptualize this as an information war. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the successes that we've had in this past year, because obviously it's very difficult to be upbeat in any sort of way when we're watching this genocide unfold. And when I say watching, I mean that literally, because as I just said, we get this on the images on our phones every day. It's very difficult to experience that for an entire year and be hopeful and be optimistic. But there are reasons to be hopeful and to be optimistic. And I think if you look at the BDS movement, for example, and the successes that it has had in the past 12 months, unprecedented successes, I think there's reason to be hopeful and to be optimistic. Of course, the world has failed Palestinians. But when we say the world, usually we're talking about the elites, the people in power, the governments. These have failed Palestinians. Of course, it's transparent for anyone to see. But people at the grassroots, all over the world, from Europe to North America to South America to Africa to Asia, they have not. They refuse. They refuse to just stand and take this. They refuse to be silent. And it's not merely symbolic. This is having tremendous impact on Israel and in Israel. The Israeli economy is doing very poorly, is doing very badly. We've had over 50,000 businesses have shut down in Israel since October last year. The mood, if you read Israeli newspapers, is extremely negative. They're, considering the viability of Israel as an economy, as a state in the mid and long term. The BDS movement has had tremendous successes in pressuring complicit companies to end their complicity with Israel. To mention one example from Europe, AXA, after a very long, arduous campaign by the BDS movement, announced that it has fully divested from Israeli banks and from Elbit Systems, which is the biggest weapons manufacturer in Israel. This is one of the largest financial services companies in the world that we're talking about here. Investment has almost completely dried up. Huge projects have been halted. Intel halted the construction of a factory in Israel, which was an investment that was worth $25 billion. $25 billion is a lot of money. It's the biggest BDS success ever. Huge companies like Coca-Cola, like McDonald's, have seen their bottom line hurt by grassroots boycotts happening across the globe, across the world. So it's important not to lose sight of that. And also on the other side as well, the huge mobilization campaign to impose a military embargo on Israel, which all countries have the obligation to do, of course, but very few have done so. Of course, the most important one, the United States, hasn't done that at all. But that hasn't stopped grassroots activists around the world. They have been identifying ships that are carrying weapons to Israel, and they're acting to pressure governments to prevent them from docking, and they've done so successfully now in many cases. There's a ship right now, as we speak, in the Mediterranean called the Katrin, which has been a huge campaign by BDS activists around the world for weeks now. There's a ship that was identified that it was carrying explosives to Israel, explosives that were going to be used, of course, to massacre Palestinians in Gaza. It tried to dock in Namibia. Activists pressured the Namibian government to deny them permission to dock. That was successful. It then went over to Europe. It's just tried docking in Malta. It was denied permission to do that as well. It's flying a Portuguese flag. There was huge pressure on the Portuguese government to withdraw the Portuguese flag from the ship, which got to the point that the ship itself announced that it has the intention of not flying the Portuguese flag anymore, applying to be deflagged. And there's pressure, of course, on governments around the world not to allow the ship to be registered in their countries. Another ship was denied docking permission in Spain. And as a matter of fact, this ship that I was talking about, the Katrin, of course, the DiEM25's political party in Greece was among the activist organizations that pressured its government not to even think about giving the ship permission to dock in their countries. So this is all significant. This is not just merely symbolic. Of course, it's an uphill battle for as long as the United States, the most military powerful country in the history of the earth, still supports Israel unconditionally, regardless of the extent and the barbarity of its war crimes. It's an uphill battle. But there are reasons to be hopeful. There are reasons to be optimistic, even in face of the horrors that we've witnessed in the past 12 months. So it's important that we don't lose sight of that. It's important that we keep up the pressure, because if governments around the world and companies around the world won't fulfill their duties under international law to end their complicity with genocide, with apartheid, with occupation, then it's up to us, it's up to the people in each of those countries to pressure our governments, to pressure our corporations to do what they're unwilling to do, which they shouldn't be unwilling to do because it's a very easy moral choice. But we've proven that we can't do that successfully. We've proven that not only in the case of Israel, but in the other historical case of apartheid with South Africa. And that's what we have to do. That's what we have to keep doing.
Thank you, Lucas. And I'd like to reference, there's a piece in The Guardian a couple of days ago. It's called "Israel Was Told You Are Not Alone, but a Year of War Has Left It Isolated" by Patrick Wintour. We can put a link in the chat. And this does note exactly what you're saying. I mean, there's actually evidence of just how isolated Israel has become, according to various polls. I mean, one poll, survey of people in 43 countries found that, 23,800 people across 31 countries found that Israel was the country that the most people said used its influence for bad. That's from Policy Institute at King's College London, and various other polls that show there's been a real PR hit for Israel. Carolina Wehrmann, if I can bring you into the chat now. Lucas laid out some of the successes that he felt that pro-Palestine activism has achieved in recent months and prior to that. You're based in Germany, as other people on this panel, and Germany has really been hit with quite a high degree of suppression of pro-Palestinian voices. Can you comment a little bit on the challenges of activism, and also particularly in the academic community in Germany? How has the academic community responded to the conflict and the suppression of pro-Palestinian voices there?
Thank you, Mahdan. Well, I'm an academic myself, so whatever I say might have an implication. If I can start on a general remark on what's happening in Germany in the last year, curtailing the freedom of science has been one of it. I mean, Wieland was mentioning the pro-Palestinian protest camps of students throughout Germany. There's been this very worrying case a couple of weeks ago involving Freie Universität in Berlin, where actually a number of scientists had endorsed the students' protests in an open letter. They said that irrespective of of your opinion on the war in Gaza, students should have the right to protest. So they weren't even particularly pro-Palestinian. Then, in response to that, there was a sequence of emails leaked by the Federal Ministry of Education, where the deputy minister was looking for a way to cut funding to those scientists, which, of course, is an unprecedented and horrible thing that caused quite a stir. The minister is still in its position. So that regards freedom of science. And of course, if you express your opinion on Palestine, and that's not only the case for scientists throughout Germany, that's any public position that you have might bring you into trouble. We've had this with public comedians that have quite a reputation, or even with a very well-known philosopher, Richard David Brecht, who lost his honorary professorship over a, admittedly unfortunate comment on what Orthodox Jews were allowed to work on. So there is the climate of intimidation in science, but it's so much more. I mean, we have the pro-Palestinian protests. I'm living in Kreuzberg when I'm in Germany, and every second week we have protests in front of our door. We have particularly POCs being hunted down and beaten by the police. You see that the threshold of violence is very, very low, actually. So this climate we felt rising. We had a comment by the deputy chair of the Federal Police Union, who had been shown a video actually by a minor being beaten brutally by the police. And he said publicly that that was both legal and actually the right thing to do. And it shouldn't wonder us because there's been Germany-wide, the criminalization of pro-Palestinian voices, dehumanization, othering of people, particularly if they have a Muslim background. We have the curtailing. I mean, oh God, I don't know. I mean, I don't know where to start. It's been freedom of art, actually. There has been the biggest modern art fair in Kassel, the Documenta, which many might know, where there was a huge stir caused 2 years ago when Palestinian art was prohibited. We had a case now a couple of days ago where a Palestinian artist, his name is Mohammed Al-Hawajri, he created a series of collages actually depicting the human rights violations in Gaza and mingling that with famous European art. This art, the most famous, is titled Guernica Gaza, so reference to Pablo Picasso's famous painting. It was exhibited in a pro-Palestinian cafe in Kassel. And this cafe was vandalized shortly after. There was an inscription put at night titled Judenfeind, so enemy of the Jews. And we know from Johannes, our fellow DMLer, that there have been other incidents throughout Germany. So that reminds us of very, very dark times of Germany. Just to cite a few worrying developments, but of course, I mean, we're all wondering, what can we do? Is the general zeitgeist changing? And I would also like to conclude on a more positive note. On the one hand, we've seen October 7, 2023, the Brandenburg Gate being lit in the colors of the Israeli flag. It happened yesterday again. So on the one hand, you could summarize and say that on the elite, on the government level, on the mainstream media outlet level, nothing has changed. But underneath, you see, and it has been mentioned by Wieland, by Yanis, that there is some commotion. And if I can give you some numbers, at least, we know from public opinion polls like the Allensbach or Infratestimab that public opinion does not endorse the government's unconditional support of Israel. And there's even a growing resentment and distrust in public media outlets. And what I see coming back to academia, I would also very much back what Wieland actually said, that the student protest and the awareness and the activity that we see around in universities is something that should give us hope. And if I can conclude on a personal note, when I gave my first seminar a couple of years ago, more than a couple of years ago, on Israel and Palestine, and I was asking the students if they knew what the Nakba was, most of them didn't. Now, this has changed completely. There is awareness, there is a growing sensitivity connected to anti-racism, to post-colonialism. And I think that you see that. And as Wieland was mentioning also, it's an intergenerational thing. So I think that we can put our hopes on the younger generation.
Thank you very much for that, Carolina. And Keskin on the chat, he says, We've spoken for a long time. The question is, what's the solution? And as we move to close our conversation today, I mean, we will go on a little bit longer if we need to, but I would like us to think a bit more about what is it that we can do differently. Wieland, if I can bring you back in, you suggested that there was a need to build broader coalitions for Jewish peace movements and perhaps beyond. Can you speak to that and any other strategic changes that you're thinking now that might have more of an impact going forward?
Well, I didn't mean that to apply only to I said to Jewish movements, of course. I mean, our organization has always been very explicit about the fact that, you know, we're not just speaking as Jews. Obviously, that's in our name, but that we are standing by Palestinians, that solidarity with them is our highest imperative. And that also, I think now the more the awareness increases, also the more important it is for us to hold true to that principle and to make sure that we are using any advantages that we might have because of our identity in order to give more visibility and more access to Palestinians. Of course, groups like ours are also hated by the authorities and the establishment. So, you know, our privilege is maybe slightly limited, but there are still, you know, there are still situations where people will maybe ask us about something before they ask Palestinians, and where it's crucial that we and other Jewish groups say, well, okay, then let's invite some Palestinians. Let's ask them what they think instead of just, you know, us talking about them, just because you suddenly discovered that they're anti-Zionist Jews. You know, it's still a novelty for some people, but yeah, but sometimes I have to remind them. You know, when people contact us about events like panels or talks or whatever. You know, and when they find it sort of interesting or brave or whatever, the position that we're taking, you know, and the Palestinian issue is important to them, we sometimes just have to remind them, you know, thanks for inviting us and everything, but look, we need to have a Palestinian here as well. You know, it's so there's a greater awareness for this now. This is also, I think, a generational change that's coming, just because the last 50 years in Germany have really seen a change, you know, a change in the diversity of society. You know, Germany 50 years ago was much whiter than it is now. And there are white Germans who somehow haven't woken up to this fact yet. You know, it hasn't quite penetrated their consciousness. And, you know, some of them are well-meaning and we can reach them and we can maybe bring them into the movement, or at least if they're not willing to get their hands quite as dirty as we have, to support it in some other way. You know, I mean, after all, joining movement isn't just about being visible on the street. It can be about giving expert advice or assistance in other forms. So, you know, it's important also to focus on the fact that the issue of equality for Palestinians and liberation for Palestinians is part of the wider anti-racist and anti-imperialist cause. And, you know, the various organizations that represent groups experiencing discrimination, you know, many sort of migrant or POC activist groups, you know, they generally get this. And which is why also some more white bourgeois leftists don't like to work with them. because it confronts them with the flaws in their analysis. So what's, I think, one of the most important things really is to use also the momentum of the interest and the passion about Palestine, also to bring together the struggle against racism, against discrimination, which works both ways, because it can inform people, who feel strongly about Palestine more about, anti-Black or anti-Roma or anti-queer discrimination. And at the same time, it can also introduce people from those groups, from those causes. It can also introduce them more to the Palestine issue and give them more information. So I think this alliance building in those terms, really from the bottom, not just thinking about, okay, how can we, lobby the government, which is, the way some people would prefer to approach it. But actually, we need to really build from the bottom and mobilize those resources.
Thank you, Wieland. Very important point there about building alliances across social justice movements that often gets neglected. Evie Petsangoreki, you haven't spoken yet. I'd love your take on what you've heard specifically regarding solutions and how we can actually move forward from here.
Well, good evening from me as well. At first place, I think we already do, because I started from being interested on the case of Palestine since the first Intifada, the beginning. So for a very, very, very long period, according to my experience, it was very difficult to speak up for Palestine, to explain, to find a field that will not end up calling them terrorists. Because this story, this caramel is really old. And after last year's attack of Hamas, see a big change that little by little, by efforts like ours, by grassroots efforts, by some movements, mainly of the clear left, I would say, they succeeded to communicate the problem, to make it public, and now finally we can even speak up for a state, for even one state without apartheid, one state of equal citizens, no matter of religion or origin. This is a big difference between 2 years ago and nowadays. I have to confess that I was in my second studies some 20 years ago, and it was in 1204, I think, that 1203, that there were student selections. In the meanwhile, there was an invasion of, there was a hit of Israel, if I remember well, it was on Bethlehem. And even the radical leftists had no idea about what is going on in Palestine. Even the radical leftists. So they were about to succeed with all these deals with the Arab countries to really bury the case of Palestine. So yes, we are doing things. Yes, there are happening things. Also, talking about October the 7th of last year, I would say definitely I'm against attacking two innocent people, two innocent civilians. Yet we have to define, when we talk about terrorists, what exactly is a terrorist? Because I personally, feel real terror day by day by all these massacres, considering that they are expanding more and more and more. So how do we define a terrorist? Is it clear that terrorist is the one who's causing terror, or we have to define it somehow else? Because this refrain with the terrorists is really, it sounds funny considering the attack of the pages in Lebanon, that instead of denouncing it, we saw people applauding it because they used a very sophisticated way to attack to whom? To civilians. And then we have Netanyahu convicted by the ICC speaking in the United Nations. How comes? What, under which right he's speaking to the United Nations, and at the same time he's invading in all the neighboring countries. He's ordering evacuation to another country. Who's doing that besides the strictly occupation armies? Who else is doing that to another country? Do we need other words to describe it? Do we need to be polite? I don't think so anymore. I don't think so anymore. And as about the US and Israel, either Israel is doing the dirty job for the US, or already Netanyahu is controlling the US, on my humble opinion. One of the two. I don't see anything else between the two.
Thank you, Evie.
And the excuse
sorry
me.
to cut you off. Sorry, you paused. Go ahead. Finish your point.
I was about to comment on the so-called divine order to have the land. Well, how comes that we create Islamophobia and not Zionistophobia? How comes?
Thank you, Evie, for
Thank you.
For giving us the lay of the land and the challenges ahead. Lucas, you had your hand up, and I would like to bring you in, and then Wieland. But Lucas, before I hand over to you, regarding tactics, I went through some blogs of activists who were working specifically on this issue, and the conclusions I came out with were that there were two main critiques of how they have waged the online PR campaign against what Israel is doing so far. The first was echo chamber effect, that they were creating awareness but not necessarily changing the minds of people outside their bubble or reaching policymakers. And the second was that there was a lack of a link from the viral content that they were putting out to concrete actions, calls to action. So I would like your comment on that, if you would agree with that, or if you would, if there's something else that you think needs doing. And then, of course, please make the point that you wanted to make, Lucas.
I mean, I agree with the last part, that obviously sometimes that call to concrete action is missing a little bit. And look, it's understandable, because especially in the early days, it's like the images that you see, the things that are happening are so devastating. I think you kind of, it's understandable if a human being, finds themselves just in disbelief, almost in denial that this could take place in 2024, and nothing's done about it. Like, they're just sending more weapons, So just it's hard to sort of like tame the rage inside of you. Sometimes, just almost a despair inside of you. But I think we have to move on to strategic, concrete action now. And with that in mind, I wanted to agree completely with Wieland. We need to build coalitions. That's absolutely crucial. And there are just so many ways, because Israel's crimes and transgressions are so wide-ranging. There's just so many coalitions that you can build, and that are being built, and that have been built in the past, to support Palestinian rights, but to go also beyond that, because this struggle is intersectional at the end of the day. So, to mention the very obvious, you have Jewish people, you have Jewish activists, countless of them around the world, like Wieland, like the comrades in Jewish Voice in Germany, in the US, who just refuse to have the state act in their name, and I've had the pleasure and the honor of marching side by side with many of them in the past few months, alongside Palestinians, of course, and many others. There aren't that many Jews left in Germany, unfortunately, but if you would like to see a few of them, I think there's no better place than a pro-Palestine demonstration. I think that's the higher concentration of them by far. Unfortunately, many of them are getting beat up and arrested by the police, but that's a different conversation. So that's one. Then another, indigenous people. The Palestinians are indigenous people getting oppressed, getting dispossessed, getting having genocide inflicted upon them. That is happening, has happened to indigenous people all around the world. Yanis was speaking about that earlier. As a matter of fact, some of the companies that are making a killing, profiting off this genocide and the apartheid of the Palestinians, Chevron, for instance, they're also destroying literally the planet. So you have climate activism here. Also, the land of indigenous people in South America. Chevron has that bill to food as well. So there's another coalition there. Migrants refugees in Europe. The same companies and the same methods of control that are developed and tested on the Palestinian people by companies like Elbit Systems that we were talking about earlier, and many others, not only them. These are then exported around the world to do things like, for instance, controlling refugees in the Mediterranean, the deadliest border in the world, where they are left on purpose, we have to emphasize, to die as a deterrent against more refugees coming. The same drones that fly over them are, in many cases, this exact same models of drones flying over Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem. So there's another coalition to be built there, coalition that is being built there. So this is absolutely crucial. The companies and the governments are complicit in what's happening to Palestinians. That's not, by and large, the only negative effect that they're having in the world. So we need to build those coalitions and pressure them from all sides, which is, of course, a core of what the BDS movement is built to do, which is why I think it's so important that we engage in it. And lastly, I just wanted to mention as well, because so many people in the chat are asking, okay, what can we do? What can we do? I know that this might sound vague to them, like build coalitions. So I'm going to give you something very practical that you can just start doing right away. If you're a student, does your university, if you're a university student, does your university have ties to Israeli universities? Israeli universities are all complicit in the occupation, apartheid, and genocide of Palestinians. The institutions around the world have the obligation to cut ties with them until they end this complicity. Does your institution have ties with such institutions in Israel? If the answer is yes, start a campaign. If there isn't one ongoing already, which is there's a good chance that there is, then join it. But build a movement inside your institution. Not talking about anything crazy here, like internationally or in your country, in your institution, in your university. Get a movement going to pressure them to cut ties with those universities. Many students have done so successfully just in the past few months and beyond, of course, all around the world, in Europe and many other places. Do you have a pension fund? What about your pension funds? Does it have investments in Israel and in companies that are complicit in the oppression of Palestinians? If the answer is yes, pressure them to withdraw those investments. That's what we call divestment. Pressure them to do that. Again, especially if we're talking about larger funds, there's a very good reason that people are organizing to do that already. If you're involved in sports, there's a huge boycott movement going on there. If you're a customer of any of the companies that are priority targets of the BDS movement, then boycott those and make sure that you let them know why you're boycotting them and see if there are movements where you live being built to not just boycott them with your wallet, but also to create pressure, which is hugely important as well. Go in front of the headquarters, attend shareholders meetings. Maybe you're a shareholder yourself. Maybe you can ask the CEO a nice question in that shareholders meeting. There's just so many ways that you can get involved. There's so many ways that you can act. If it sounds too small to you, that's the name of the game. You know, it's always it happens by and large on a small scale, but it adds up. Trust me, it's adding up right now. It will continue to add up, and we need more and more people to make it add up even more so that we can reach a tipping point to pre-Palestine.
Thank you, Lucas, and especially for your practical, doable suggestions. Wieland, I would like to close with you, our special guest. Perhaps you can wrap up, and I'll leave it to you to decide where you would like to take it.
Yeah, thanks, Mehran. Yeah, what Lucas just said is very important because of the sense of helplessness one can feel. And, you know, I and many other activists have done countless sort of talks or panels with, you know, Q&A with the audience, and people ask, yeah, what can I do? Feel like I can't do anything, you know, and there are so many forms and levels of complicity. The ones that Lucas has mentioned, also, you know, it could be your workplace, it could be your school, their exchange program with Israel, whatever. There are many, many things. I wanted to pick up a bit what Evie said about Israel influencing America, because I think it's important to stress that they are one team, they are one side, and that, of course, you know, there is a strong, politically and financially strong Israel lobby in the US, but the only reason that can even be the case, and that they can have so much influence, is because it aligns with the interests of US and Western imperialism. And just as before Israel was founded, the British thought that it would be their asset in the Middle East. That backfired a bit. They lost control. But then after the Six-Day War in 1967, the US realized that they need this power extension in the Middle East, and they've been using it ever since. And the question some people ask, you know, repeatedly, especially now, I mean, the more Israel escalates, the more people ask themselves, you know, what would it take for someone to step in? Is there any red line for America? Is there any point where the US would decide, no, you know, they've gone too far? You know, if they drop a nuclear bomb on Gaza, would this still somehow be accepted? And, you know, America is not going to condemn what Israel does any more than it would condemn itself. I mean, it would essentially mean to condemn itself, because Israel, as we see it now, is a product of having American arms and money and unquestioning political support pumped into it for decades. And without American support, the last months would not have happened. Mehran, you wanted to say something there?
I do. I would just want to ask you a question on that quickly, if I may. Do you believe that irrespective of who wins the US election, that the policy towards Israel is going to stay exactly the same?
Pretty much. I mean, we saw when Trump got in, we saw that he immediately tried to even kind of heighten American support for Israel in partially symbolic ways, but, you know, they had real consequences, like, for example, opening a US embassy in Jerusalem. And then also, you know, the Abraham Accords, which amounted to, you know, normalization of the occupation with Arab collaborator states. And so, yeah, there are, but I mean, these are, I think, minor compared to the consistency. You know, there are also some people who argue, look, Trump thinks more like an isolationist. He's not interested in global domination so much as, you know, enriching himself and America first, etc. But I think that also falls short based on his past record. You know, even if that's his agenda, you know, and he's more of a mob boss than a conqueror. You know, I don't think that it would have any advantages for Palestinians. But actually, something that's a quite remarkable irony, and maybe it sort of exemplifies the unusual or exceptional situation we're in now, is that it's quite conceivable that the Democrats might lose the election because of their support for the genocide. Now, historically, it's often been the case that the Israel lobby was able to mobilize certain forces to threaten or to unseat politicians. And it was said that, in order to get voted, certain politicians would have to be faithful to Israel, etc. But now, I mean, in Michigan, there's a very high population of Arab, Lebanese, Palestinian Americans, and other Muslims who feel very strongly about Palestine, and they're just saying, look, it doesn't matter how much you try to blackmail us by saying, oh, well, do you want Trump to get in? We cannot vote for the people who massacred our people. How can you ask that of us? And Harris refuses to back down. And there you can see the difference between the power of a subsidized lobby and the power of people voting with their feet. And if getting elected were the priority, then Harris would try to, and her team would try to get those voters, right? One would think politicians want to get elected, so they'll say what they need in order to get elected. But she will not do that. I remember this one event where there were some protesters, and she said, "Do you want Trump?" She said that to them. And so if that's her attitude, if she is willing to forfeit the election for that, that proves that American empire is the priority.
Wieland, thank you very much. And thank you to our panel. We have gone a little bit over, but it was a very important discussion on the anniversary of the October 7th attacks. So I hope you'll all forgive us for going on a bit longer than usual. If you would like to be informed when we put a new video out, then just hit the bell icon on YouTube. If you'd like to join DM25, if you'd like something that you've heard here and would like to be part of this fight, then simply go to dm25.org/join. Thank you again to our panel. Thank you to you out there. And we will see you at the regular time of 6 p.m. CET 2 weeks from now. Take care and stay safe.